I touched Miss Ledford on the breast with the cold metal pliers, and if you listen to the tape, you'll hear those pliers being replaced in the toolbox a few seconds later.
Oh, what did you touch her on the breast for with a pair of pliers?
To shock her with the cold metal.
In 1977, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris met in the California men's colony while serving their time for robbery and assault. They became friends and discovered they shared very similar interests, young women, particularly teenagers. They became close and started sharing their fantasies of dominating, torturing, and raping these girls. But it didn't stop there. They began plotting realistic ways to abduct women in order to torture and rape them. They plotted for months and even settled on the ages they were more interested in, which were 13 to 19 years old. They thought the younger the women, the easier it would be to dominate them. So, who were these men and how did they end up in prison sharing these sick fantasies with each other? Let's start with the oldest of the two, Lawrence Bittaker. Lawrence Bittaker was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on September 27, 1940. Shortly after being born, he was given up for adoption and taken to an orphanage. He was then adopted by George Bittaker and his wife. George Bittaker worked in the aircraft industry, and because of World War II, he had to move around for his job a lot. So during Bittaker's early childhood, they lived in Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, and finally California. So even though he was adopted, he had very big abandonment issues, fueled by the fact that they moved around so much, he couldn't make any real friendships. Since the age of 12, he was arrested multiple times, mainly for shoplifting. He wasn't careful about being caught, meaning he didn't really care he was doing something wrong. He did just what he felt like, and did it mainly to get attention, something quite common among those with abandonment issues like his. During his teenage years, he continued getting into minor problems with the police. He was arrested several times, mainly for robbery. It was also during his high school years that it was discovered that Bittaker was very intelligent. He had an IQ of 138, which is basically genius. Like a lot of people with high IQs who aren't given a specific education, he found school to be useless. Because of this lack of challenge, he ended up dropping out in 1957 without graduating. But after dropping out of high school, his days of shoplifting turned into auto theft. He was also involved in a hit and run, and he evaded arrest multiple times. At one point, he would actually be sent to the California Youth Authority until the age of 19. But once he was let out, he'd be arrested again. This went on for years during his early 20s. During one of these trials, medical examinations determined he was paranoid and borderline psychotic. However, he always seemed to be paroled early and back out in the streets soon after his sentences. The final straw which sent him to the California men's colony, where he would meet Norris, was in 1974, when he tried to steal a steak from a supermarket. The shop clerk approached him, and Bittaker stabbed him in the chest, nearly killing him. Although he was charged with attempted murder and shoplifting, he was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon, meaning his sentence was much shorter. His family actually broke all contact with him when he was sent to prison for nearly killing the store clerk, again creating him that feeling of abandonment by everyone who knew him. These abandonment issues most definitely play a big role in his personality disorder, the paranoia and the complete lack of empathy towards other people. So let's talk about Roy Norris now. Roy Norris was born on February 5, 1948 in Greeley, Colorado. His father was a scrapyard worker and his mother was a housewife, which is what would be expected of her in the 40s. His parents were not married when they found out they were pregnant, so again, because it was the 40s, they actually had to get married out of social pressure. This is something they'd actually blame on Norris while growing up, which would explain his very low self-esteem. Apparently they neglected him quite a bit as well. There was never enough food in the house, he'd rarely get new clothes. He said his parents would often blame him for things he hadn't done as well. Norris moved around a lot too, but not with his parents. His mother suffered from an addiction to drugs and was unfit to take care of her son, so he'd regularly be sent to different foster homes over the years, where it's suspected he was abused both mentally and sexually. Again, psychiatrists think this is a key part in his personality disorder. His very low self-esteem, isolation, and history of abuse would play a big role in his very sadistic sexual tendencies. Unlike Bittaker's relatively harmless behavior as a teenager, Norris was a bit more troubled growing up. When he was 16 years old, he went to a relative's home for a visit. She was a 20-year-old woman. Norris made sexual approaches to her, and she kicked him out of the house. At the time, Norris was living with his parents again, and when his father was told about this, his response was to threaten to beat his son. So Norris grabbed his father's car and went to the Rocky Mountains to try to kill himself by injecting air into an artery in his arm. His attempt failed, and the police later found him and took him back to his parents, where they once again began reminding him he was unwanted and they didn't care for him. The next year, at 17 years old, he dropped out of high school to join the Navy as an electrician. He was sent to Vietnam, and while he was there, he began consuming marijuana regularly. This is the time where he also began attacking women. These two reasons were enough for the Navy to kick him out and send him back home. When he got back to California in 1969, Norris began committing crimes almost immediately. Shortly after he got back, he tried to rape a female taxi driver. He was charged with rape, assault, and attempt to commit rape, but 3 months later, he was out. Soon after that, he tried to break into a woman's house after she refused to let him in. A few months later, he also attacked a student from the San Diego University who he'd been stalking. He grabbed a rock, hit her on the head, and then bashed her head against a sidewalk as well. She miraculously survived, and Norris was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. He was sent to a mental hospital after psychiatrists considered he was a danger due to his schizoid personality. He was released in 1975 on 5 years probation because an examination determined he was no longer a danger to others. Obviously, this was a mistake because 3 months later, while he was on his motorcycle in Redondo Beach, he offered a woman a ride, which she declined. He then parked his bike and tried to strangle the woman with her own scarf. Then, he raped her in some nearby bushes. The victim reported the rape, and the police were able to identify Norris thanks to his motorcycle. So he was sent to the California Men's Colony under a charge of rape. So this is how Bittaker and Norris met, a thief and a sexual criminal who came from troubled childhoods. During their time in prison, they became friends after Bittaker stood up for Norris during a few attacks from other prisoners. They became close and started to open up more about their secrets. It's not quite clear who brought up the sexual fantasies involving teenagers, but it was probably Norris, especially since Bittaker had never actually been involved in any sexual crimes. Some psychiatrists think that it was probably after meeting Norris he developed this desire. Bittaker is the kind of person who always needs a new thrill. This is why his crimes escalated through the years. He fed off that feeling of power he got by being above the law and doing what he wanted. So this is probably why once Norris opened up about his sexual desires and fantasies, Bittaker felt challenged to go through with it. It just made something click. Norris would tell him how he found it stimulating how frightened young women would be when attacked. And Bittaker began fantasies of his own and actually said if he ever raped a woman, he'd kill her. No witnesses means there's a smaller chance of being caught. Bittaker was released on parole in October of 1978. He moved to Los Angeles and started befriending the local teens to study the best way to seem trustworthy to them. He'd offer them marijuana or alcohol, act cool around them, and just observed how they reacted. Norris was released 3 months later in January of 1979. He moved in with his mother and went back to working as an electrician. One day, he received a letter from Bittaker inviting him to resume their plan, now that he'd had some time to prepare. Shortly after the release of Norris, both men put some money together and bought a silver 1977 GMC cargo van with no windows in the back and a sliding door on the passenger side. They modified it and installed a folding bed. And underneath it, they stored a cooler to keep drinks in, which was a big part of their plan to lure teenage girls into the van. But next to the coolers there was also a toolbox, complete with pliers, a sledgehammer, and even ice picks. They named their van the Murder Mac. So once the Murder Mac, was ready, Bittaker and Norris spent weeks driving up and down the Pacific Coast Highway, frequenting the local beaches. They'd flirt with the girls, offer them alcohol and marijuana, even take their pictures using Polaroids. They didn't harm any of them. This was just a test run for the real deal. They wanted to study the best areas, the best method, and the best excuse to kidnap teenage girls. This area was full of hitchhikers. Young girls would catch rides to the beach or in between towns, so there was always a target for Norris and Bittaker. They found a fire road deep into the mountains, an area which was actually gated and locked, but Bittaker took out his handy toolbox and snapped the lock off. On this fire road there were actually areas which couldn't be accessed by vehicle, they had to be trailed on foot. There was also a large number of canyons and cliffs in this area, which were perfect to dispose of bodies. Whatever wasn't hidden enough once dropped off a cliff would be taken care of by the wild animals. So they started doing these test runs with the girls they picked up at beaches up to the mountains. Again, none of these girls were harmed as they were only being used to test out how long it would take them to drive there, how long they could keep them distracted with pot and alcohol, all these things. Most of these girls were teenagers looking to break some rules, so they would willingly get into the van with two middle-aged men. But just in case any of them resisted, they had a backup plan. Norris would hide in the back of the van and snatch a girl from the sliding passenger door if necessary. The radio was also on point. They were planning to turn up the volume to block out any screaming. The plan was all set to go. On June 24th, 1979, Lucinda or Cindy Schaefer was leaving a church meeting at Redondo Beach. She was 16 years old, blonde, and had blue eyes. As she was walking home, Bittaker and Norris spotted her and drove up to her. They offered her a ride, but she declined. So they parked a little further up the road, and Norris pretended to be leaning into the van from the sliding door, so Cindy couldn't see his face. When she passed the van, Norris grabbed her from behind and dragged her inside, while Bittaker drove off, turning the radio up loud. While they drove to the hideout in the San Gabriel Mountains, Norris tied Cindy up and covered her mouth with duct tape. Once in the mountains, Norris raped her while Bittaker gave them some privacy, and after a while they switched places so Bittaker could rape her as well. Norris actually raped her once more before trying to strangle her with his own hands, but apparently he couldn't do it and actually had to run off and throw up somewhere. Bittaker then took over and strangled her until she started convulsing. Then he went into the toolbox and got a coat hanger and twisted it around her neck using pliers. It wasn't long before she died. After raping and murdering her, they wrapped her in a shower curtain and threw her off a canyon for the wild animals to deal with the remains. On July 18, 1979, Bittaker and Norris were driving through the Pacific Coast Highway and came across Andrea Hall, who was an 18-year-old hitchhiker. This time they tried something different. Norris hid in the back of the van while Bittaker stopped and offered Andrea a cool drink. It was a hot summer day, so Andrea accepted. As she was reaching to the back of the van for the cooler, Norris jumped at her and grabbed her. She put up quite the fight, but regardless, they were able to get her into the van, tied her up, and made their way to the San Gabriel Mountains. They raped her several times, and at one point Norris thought he saw headlights, so they decided to go even deeper into the mountains. This is where Bittaker begins to show his cruelest behavior. He made her walk naked up a hill, and then made her pose for Polaroid pictures in several positions. Norris left to go buy some beer at some point, and when he got back, Bittaker had already killed Andrea. He had more pictures, including some of her face in complete terror. Apparently, he had asked her to list the reasons why he should let her live, and had immediately stabbed her in the ear with an ice pick, actually reaching her brain. Then, he inserted the pick in her other ear and stepped on it. After that, he strangled the little life she had left in her and threw her body off another canyon, just like they'd done with Cindy. On September 3rd, 1979, Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp were 15 and 13 years old. Norris and Bittaker found them at a bus stop near Hermosa Beach and offered them a ride, as well as a drink and some marijuana. Both girls accepted and got into the van. They needed a ride to the beach and hadn't had any luck hitchhiking that day. While they were driving, the girls noticed the van was taking a different exit and heading towards the San Gabriel Mountains, so they started panicking. Leah tried to open the passenger door to get out, but Norris hit her with a bag full of weights he kept in the back of the van. While he was tying Jackie up, Leah regained consciousness and tried to escape again. This time she got out, but Norris was faster and actually grabbed her and put her in the van again. Once they reached the mountains, they took turns sexually and physically attacking the girls, as well as making them pose for pornographic Polaroids. But this time, unlike they'd done with the previous attacks, they kept them captive for 2 whole days, taking turns sleeping next to them, while the other man kept a watch in case someone spotted them. They also had a tape recorder with them this time, and Bittaker taped the moment he was raping Jackie. One of the girls was also asked to roleplay as Norris's cousin while he raped her. Both girls were severely tortured, using ice pick and pliers on their breasts. Jackie was murdered with the ice pick in her head and then strangled, and Leah was killed by Norris using a sledgehammer on her, while Bittaker strangled her. The two girls were thrown over an embankment. Jackie and Leah were reported missing by their families, but the police treated this as a runaway case, which is something that happened a lot in the 70s. So many missing people cases were treated as runaways, losing the critical first few hours when it's a lot easier to trace back the missing person's steps and locate witnesses. This reminds me of the case of Pamela Hobley and Patricia Spencer, which we covered a few videos ago. They also disappeared without a trace and were never found, and the police treated it like a runaway too, so they didn't actually start investigating properly until days later. It's very possible that having started the investigation earlier, they would have found something, but who knows. On Halloween night 1979, Norris and Bittaker had changed the Pacific Coast Highway for the San Fernando Valley. That's where they spotted Lynette Ledford, age 16. She was trying to get a ride home after a Halloween party where she'd had a fight with her boyfriend, so she was on her own. Bittaker actually knew Lynette from the restaurant she worked at as a waitress, and she recognized him too, so when they offered her a ride, she got into the van. This time, since they were so far away from the Sangerville Mountains hideout, they decided to rape and torture her on the move. Norris pulled out a knife to threaten Lynette and made it easier to tie her up and gag her with tape. Then, they changed places so Norris was driving and Bittaker started to torture Lynette by hitting her and telling her to scream louder. While he told her to keep screaming, he punched her breast and hit her several times with a sledgehammer. Then, he also used the pliers to torture her repeatedly while he was raping her. He also had his tape recorder at hand and taped the whole attack. Norris took his turn raping and torturing Lynette too, particularly bashing her arm with a sledgehammer. The attack went on for about 2 hours until Norris strangled her with a coat hanger and pliers. Then, they simply tossed the body out of the van and left it in someone's garden. Her body would be found early in the morning by a jogger who immediately called the police. Lynette's autopsy listed all the injuries she sustained, and it was terrifying. She had compression marks to the neck, blunt force trauma to the head, face, and breasts, vaginal and rectal tearing, multiple fractures to the elbow, lacerations to the fingers, and a puncture wound to her hand. At this point, Bittaker and Norris were feeling so above the law they didn't even care they'd left a body out in the middle of the street. None of the other bodies had been found, nobody had linked them to the disappearances of the other 4 girls, and at first glance it didn't look like Lynette's brutal murder was linked to them either. So how did they get caught? Well, they got sloppy, especially Norris. You see, before Lynette's murder, Bittaker and Norris had attempted to abduct another girl, Shirley Sanders, who was walking along Manhattan Beach and was approached by the men. They offered her a ride and she said no and kept on walking. But they wouldn't take no for an answer, so they attacked her with pepper spray and pulled her into the van, where they took turns raping her. At one point, both men were distracted and she managed to escape the van and run for her life. Luckily, they weren't able to catch her. Shirley went straight to the police and reported the attack, but she didn't get the van's license plate, nor could she identify the men properly, since she'd been attacked with pepper spray. She did, however, remember the silver van, but that wasn't enough information for the police to actually narrow down suspects. Norris and Bittaker knew the police could knock on their door any minute, so they lay low for a few weeks. Bittaker even changed apartments just in case. But after a few weeks, it didn't seem like the police were onto them, so they relaxed and got back into their old ways. Even though they hadn't been identified, the murder mag was now on the police's radar. But Norris was the one who led the police straight to his door. In October, Norris had met up with a former prison cellmate of his, Jimmy Dalton, and he started bragging to him about the murders he and Bittaker were committing. He actually gave details of what they were doing to the bodies, how they were treating the victims, everything. Dalton didn't take it seriously. Norris was a strange man, he'd made up stories before, so he thought he was just making things up to look tough. But when the media began talking about Lynette's body being found and the injuries she sustained, Dalton had a feeling this was exactly what Norris had been talking about. So he talked to his lawyer and they went to the police to give them the information Norris had given him. At first they didn't believe the words of an ex-con, but when he mentioned they were driving around in a silver van, the detective in charge of the case connected it to the rape victim's testimony from the previous month. The police went back to Shirley with a lineup of pictures to see if this way she could identify the men who had attacked her. She went through them all and eventually picked Norris and Bittaker's pictures. So now the police had 2 identified suspects. Both attackers were put under surveillance and the police waited for the perfect moment to arrest them, in order to build a strong case against them. Norris was caught shortly after while selling marijuana, therefore violating his parole terms. Once they had Norris, he quickly pointed the finger at Bittaker too, and both men were arrested and charged for Shirley's abduction and rape. When the police questioned Norris about his involvement in the rape of Shirley and the murder of Lynette, he initially denied it. Then he began putting the blame on Bittaker, saying he was the mastermind behind it all. But soon enough he told the police everything about the abductions, how they forced the girls into the van or lured them in with drugs and alcohol. He told them about the Sangerville Mountains hideout, how they were using tools to rape, attack and kill the girls, how they were disposing of the bodies, everything. Norris's initial confessions were only the tip of the iceberg. As soon as they were arrested, the police searched both men's homes in the van and found heaps of evidence. Over 500 Polaroid pictures of girls, some just girls they met in the test runs, others of the actual victims. Investigators tried to locate all the women to see if they were all victims of Bittaker and Norris. Many of these girls were found alive and well, but others turned out to be listed as missing people. However, it couldn't be proven that they killed any of them, and neither of the men admitting to doing so. This was an area with more serial killers on the loose, so any of them could have been the actual killers. Another piece of evidence they found was acid, which Norris said they were planning to use on their next attack. Several tools were found too, such as a sledgehammer and the bag of weights, so they hadn't even tried to hide the evidence properly. But the worst piece of evidence was a tape recording of Lynette Ledford's attack. Bittaker tried to dispose of the tapes when he learned the police were onto him, but he forgot Lynette's tape in the van. This piece of evidence would be crucial in the trial. Norris also helped locate the bodies and led investigators to the fire road at the Sangerville Mountains, but Andrea and Cindy's bodies couldn't be found, probably because wild animals had already got to them. Jackie and Leah's bodies were found shortly after, and Jackie's skull still had the ice pick embedded in the bone. Norris quickly entered a guilty plea and was offered a deal thanks to his cooperation in the investigation. Bittaker, however, maintained his innocence and would never admit to any of the charges.
Did you at any time ever use an ice pick?
No, sir.
You struck Miss Lamp with a sledgehammer. Do you recall the sledgehammer which was introduced?
Yes, sir, I recall it.
Was that true?
No, sir.
Part of Norris's deal was to testify against Bittaker, which he did, and presented him as the mastermind in all the murders. He said he was only in it out of fear of what Bittaker could do to him if he didn't help him. He also stated he committed the sexual assaults and rapes out of satisfaction for the domination over women. It was determined he was an extreme sociopath, and his behavior was beyond rehabilitation. The deal saved him from the death penalty, and he was given 45 years to life with the possibility of parole. Bittaker's trial had a main witness, Norris, who went into detail of all the abductions, murders, who killed each victim, how they disposed of the bodies, which tools they used on each woman, etc. Other witnesses included a cellmate of Bittaker's whom he had told how he stabbed Jackie with an ice pick several times. The defense tried to put the blame on Norris, and said that Bittaker had only engaged in sexual activities with the victims. Bittaker even testified on his own behalf, stating he had nothing to do with the murders, and he had only met some of the victims in exchange for sex, but he hadn't killed them. However, there was a piece of evidence which made up the jury's mind a lot quicker. The 17-minute-long recording of Lynette's attack was played in the courtroom, and the jury members were all in tears. Several people in the audience even had to leave the room before it was over. Norris had told in his statement that after killing Lynette, Bittaker would actually play the recording while they were driving. Everyone who has listened to that recording has been absolutely traumatized.
I've heard screams before. I thought I'd be able to sit and listen, but I've never heard anything like that in my life.
I just couldn't believe it. I have a daughter, and I just could see her, and I couldn't take it.
And you've heard it obviously several times before, and it still seems to affect you obviously quite deeply.
Investigators had to listen to it repeatedly, and to this day it still haunts them. Lynette's mother actually listened to it in order to identify her daughter's voice as the victim. Apparently, while it was playing, Bittaker was completely calm and even smiled. The jury found Bittaker guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 5 charges of kidnapping, 9 charges of rape, among other charges of sodomy, unlawful possession of a firearm, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murders. He was given the death penalty and appealed several times, but his sentence never changed. Bittaker and Norris were sent to different prisons, and since Norris had the possibility of parole, he actually kept a pretty low profile and behaved. But Bittaker actually started suing the prison system, saying they were constantly violating his rights. These complaints include receiving a broken cookie for lunch. Bittaker was on death row at the San Quentin State Prison and appealed several times, meaning his execution was postponed for years. However, in December of 2019, he died of natural causes at the age of 79. Norris spent most of his sentence at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, and although he was eligible for parole in 2009, it was denied. It was denied again 10 years later in 2019. In February of 2020, just before the global pandemic hit, he died of natural causes at the age of 72.